All right, welcome everyone to this deep dive into the world of economics. We've had a lot of you asking for help on getting a handle on, just the fundamentals.
Yep.
So we're going to be breaking down this book, Economics 101, From Consumer Behavior to Competitive Markets,
Okay.
Everything you need to know about economics. Now, I know, some of you might be thinking, economics,
Yeah.
is that going to be a bit dry?
A little bit, maybe.
It may be a little dry, but trust me, this book, right off the bat, throws out some fascinating ideas, like how expectations can actually become reality.
Yeah.
And that money, the thing we chase all the time, is basically a social construct.
Interesting.
Intrigued. Let's dive in.
Yeah, it's true. At its core, economics is about understanding how we make decisions when we can't have everything we want. It all starts with this concept of scarcity.
Scarcity. See, when I hear scarcity, I think of deserts and empty grocery store shelves. But
Right.
America, doesn't America have pretty much everything? Can we really talk about scarcity in a land of abundance?
That's where things get interesting. The book uses this comparison between scarcity in America and Somalia.
Okay.
Sure, the nature of scarcity might differ, but the principle is the same. We have limited resources,
Okay.
and we have unlimited wants. That gap between what we want and what we can actually have, that's where economics comes into play. Even here, with all our choices, we're constantly making trade-offs.
So it's not just about physical things being scarce, it's about that constant tension between what we desire and what's available.
Right.
Makes a lot of sense when you think about it that way. So the book breaks down resources into 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And I always get confused about capital versus money.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
Can you clear that up for me and for our listener?
Okay, so think of land as encompassing all natural resources, from the actual land we build on to the oil we extract and the forests we harvest.
Okay.
Labor is the human element, the skills and effort people contribute, and capital. This is where the confusion often arises. It's not about piles of money. It refers to the tools, machines, factories, the infrastructure that we use to create goods and services. Think of it as the physical stuff that we use to produce other stuff.
So it's like the difference between the hammer and the cash. You used to buy the hammer.
Exactly.
Okay, so hammer's the capital, cash is the money,
Right.
and entrepreneurship is the driving force, kind of the risk taker who brings all these factors together.
Exactly. It's the innovation, the organization, and willingness to take risks that transforms resources into valuable products and services.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got these limited resources being juggled
Right.
to satisfy, our endless wants.
Right.
And the book uses this example of someone choosing between writing a book, teaching, or weaving a hammock to illustrate trade-offs and opportunity cost. Do you think that resonates with our listeners?
Absolutely. Every decision we make means giving up something else. We can't do it all. That's where opportunity cost comes in. It's not just about the money we spend, but the value of the next best alternative that we forego. So if writing that book was the most valuable thing that you could be doing with your time, then the opportunity cost of that relaxing hammock time is a potential bestseller left unwritten.
It's a hidden cost we don't always think about.
Yeah.
But it's there with every decision. Makes you realize how precious time is, how every choice comes with a trade-off.
For sure.
Speaking of choices, the book dives into this idea of marginal analysis and how economists see us as these mini computers constantly weighing costs and benefits. They even measure satisfaction in utils, like little units of happiness.
Little units of happiness, right?
What do you think of that approach?
It sounds a bit like science fiction.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. But it does make sense that we're constantly making these calculations, even if we're not always aware of it. The book uses this example of swimming laps.
Okay.
And says, each lap might bring you a certain number of utils. How many utils would someone have to offer you to skip your next swim?
Interesting question.
Or how much would someone have to pay you to give up something you really enjoy? It's a fun way to think about how we value things.
Yeah, I like it. I like that the book uses these quirky examples to make abstract concepts relatable. But before we get too deep into economic models, we need to acknowledge that economists often work with these simplifying assumptions.
Okay, lay it on me. What are these economic secrets?
Well, not really secrets, but rather key assumptions that help create a framework for understanding complex systems.
Okay.
The first one is ceteris paribus.
Of course. It wouldn't be economics without a little Latin.
A little Latin, right?
But seriously, what does ceteris paribus actually mean?
It's a way for economists to isolate the effect of one specific change by holding everything else constant. It's like conducting a controlled experiment in a lab, except it's with real-world economic data.
So they're acknowledging that the world's messy, interconnected, but they need a way to make sense of it all.
Yeah.
What are the other assumptions they use?
Another big one is assuming rational behavior.
Okay.
Economists often model people as making decisions that maximize their well-being based on their preferences and what's available to them.
Right.
We all know people aren't always perfectly rational.
Right.
But this assumption is still a useful starting point for building models.
And then there's the assumption about self-interest being this driving force in economic decisions.
Yeah.
The book uses this pretty extreme example of a soldier jumping on a grenade and framing it as a kind of calculated self-interest to maximize their utility.
That's the provocative example.
Yeah.
But the idea is that self-interest, even in its most altruistic forms, can be a powerful motivator. Doesn't mean we're all greedy or selfish.
Yeah.
But we do generally act in ways that we believe will benefit us, whether that's through personal gain or sense of satisfaction from helping others.
So economists aren't saying that we're all cold calculating machines, but that understanding self-interest helps to kind of explain how markets work.
Right.
Now the book takes us on this historical tour of economic thought.
Okay.
Starting with mercantilism. It seemed like they were obsessed with hoarding gold.
Yeah, mercantilism, which was popular for centuries. It was all about maximizing exports and minimizing imports.
Okay.
The goal was to accumulate gold, believing that national wealth was directly tied to how much gold a country possessed.
But that seems flawed, right? Not every country can be a net exporter. Someone has to be buying those goods.
Exactly. That's where Adam Smith comes in.
Adam Smith, the father of modern economics. His book, The Wealth of Nations, revolutionized economic thinking. By introducing the idea of free trade and specialization, he argued that countries should focus on producing what they're most efficient at and then trading with each other, leading to a larger overall pie for everyone.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty straightforward, but it was a radical idea at the time.
It really was a paradigm shift. And this is where those fascinating concepts of absolute and comparative advantage come in.
Okay.
Absolute advantage is about who can produce more of something.
Yeah.
Given the same resources.
The book uses musicians as an example.
Oh.
Paul can write 2 hit songs in an hour, while Art can only write 1.
Okay.
Paul has the absolute advantage.
Right.
But
Yeah.
Here's where it gets interesting. Comparative advantage is about opportunity cost. It's not about who's better overall, but who gives up less. To produce something, the book makes it even more intriguing by adding a twist.
Oh, okay.
What if Paul and Art are also brilliant brain surgeons, each capable of performing 2 surgeries per hour? Now we have a dilemma. Paul is still the songwriting superstar, but suddenly Art has a comparative advantage in surgery because he only gives up half a song to perform a surgery, while Paul gives up a whole song.
Interesting.
This completely changes the dynamics.
Exactly. Even though Paul is great at both songwriting and surgery, it makes economic sense for him to focus on songwriting and let Art handle the surgeries. It maximizes their combined output.
Okay.
And this is why free trade, based on comparative advantage, can make everyone better off, even if it means some countries specialize in certain areas and import other goods.
It's like a grand puzzle where each country finds its piece and contributes to the overall picture.
I like that.
The book even uses an experiment with random objects to demonstrate how value increased through trading.
Yeah, do you remember that?
Yeah, it involved people trading objects they had randomly received with the goal of acquiring something they valued more. And what they found was that the total perceived value of the objects actually increased through the process of trading, even though nothing new was produced.
Interesting.
It was a powerful illustration of how trade, by moving goods to those who value them most, can create this net gain for everyone involved. That makes sense. So free trade sounds pretty great, in theory. But are there any downsides? I mean, we hear a lot about the negative impacts of globalization and trade deals.
Yeah, you're right. There are concerns. And the book acknowledges them. Environmentalists worry about looser regulations in some countries and the potential for increased pollution. Right. Labor unions express concerns about jobs moving overseas to countries with lower wages. And human rights activists raise concerns about working conditions in some developing countries.
So free trade, while beneficial in many ways, also creates these complex challenges that need to be addressed.
Exactly. It's not a simple solution.
Yeah.
And there are trade-offs to consider. But understanding the fundamental benefits of free trade, based on comparative advantage, is a crucial starting point for navigating these complex issues.
Expert speaker. So if some people want to limit free trade, how do they actually do it? I know the book talks about barriers to trade.
Yeah.
What are some of those tools that they use to kind of control the flow of goods and services?
Well, governments have a few tricks up their sleeve when it comes to restricting trade. Tariffs are probably the most common.
Okay.
It's basically a tax on imported goods, making them more expensive for consumers.
So it's a way to protect domestic industries.
By making foreign goods less competitive.
Right.
Okay.
Then there are quotas, which limit the quantity of a specific good that can be imported.
Okay.
It's a way to create artificial scarcity and drive up prices. And finally, there are embargoes, which are complete bans on trade with a specific country. Those are usually driven by political or foreign policy goals.
I remember the book talks about quotas on Japanese and German cars back in the 80s.
Yeah.
It seemed like a good idea at the time to protect American automakers. But did it really work?
It's a classic example of how government interventions, even with good intentions, can sometimes backfire. Those quotas, meant to shield American car companies from competition, actually led those foreign firms to build factories right here in the U.S.
Oh, wow. To bypass the restrictions.
Right. That's kind of ironic, isn't it? They tried to limit imports, but it ended up encouraging more foreign investment and job creation, but not necessarily for American workers.
Exactly. And those new factories increased competition, which ultimately benefited consumers by offering more choices and potentially lower prices.
Yeah.
It also put pressure on American car makers to innovate and improve their products to stay competitive. It's a reminder that markets are dynamic and often find ways to adapt to these kinds of restrictions.
Makes you wonder if those quotas actually hurt American automakers in the long run by delaying necessary changes and innovation.
It's possible.
Now, shifting gears a bit, the book talks about those big questions. Every society has to answer what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom to produce it. It seems like those questions are pretty fundamental to economics, no matter what system you're talking about.
They are. Those three questions are at the heart of how we allocate scarce resources. Whether you have a capitalist system, a socialist system, or something in between, you still have to make choices about what gets produced, how it gets produced, and who ultimately benefits from that production.
So how do those questions play out differently in different economic systems? I know the book lays out the spectrum from pure command economies to pure market economies.
Right.
And it kind of places countries along that continuum. It's not just black and white, is it?
Most countries fall somewhere in between. A pure command economy, like what you might find in North Korea, has the government controlling all the resources and making all the decisions about production and distribution.
Wow.
At the other end of the spectrum, you have a pure market economy where decisions are decentralized and driven by the forces of supply and demand with minimal government intervention.
So most countries are somewhere in between, with a mix of government involvement and market forces.
Exactly.
Where does the U.S. fall on that spectrum?
The U.S. is generally considered a mixed economy, leaning more towards the market side. We have a lot of freedom in terms of what we can produce, buy, and sell. But we also have a significant amount of government regulation, social safety net programs, and public goods provided by the government. It's a constant balancing act between individual freedom and collective action.
So it's a blend of those two approaches with ongoing debates about the right mix.
Yeah.
And that brings us to that age-old debate, capitalism versus socialism. Can you break down the key differences for us and for our listener in a way that goes beyond just slogans and political rhetoric?
Sure. Capitalism, at its core, emphasizes private ownership, free markets, and individual initiative as the drivers of economic activity. The idea is that individuals, acting in their own self-interest, will create a more efficient and prosperous society.
Okay.
Socialism, on the other hand, generally advocates for greater government control over resources, redistribution of wealth, and social welfare programs. It's about ensuring greater equality and social justice, often at the expense of some individual freedom.
So it's about different visions of how society should be organized and what values should be prioritized.
Exactly.
It's not just about economic efficiency, but also about social justice and fairness.
Right. And those values often lead to different approaches.
Yeah.
Those fundamental economic questions capitalism might lead to more innovation and higher overall wealth, but potentially also more inequality.
Okay.
Socialism might create more equality and a stronger safety net, but at the cost of slower economic growth or less individual choice.
The book does a great job of contrasting the philosophies of Adam Smith and Karl Marx, almost like a clash of the titans.
Yeah, it's almost like these two giants are having a conversation across centuries about the nature of human society and how we should organize ourselves.
That's a good way to put it. So ideas matter. It's not just about dry economic models, but about the underlying values and beliefs that shape those models.
Right.
What were some of the key differences between Smith and Marx?
Smith believed in the power of the invisible hand, that individuals acting in their own self-interest would, without intending to, create a more prosperous society. He famously said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner,
but from their regard to their own interests." So it's not about altruism or charity, but about self-interest, driving economic activity.
Right. And he saw competition and free markets as the key to unleashing that self-interest and creating a more efficient allocation of resources.
Okay.
Marx, on the other hand, had a much more critical view of capitalism. He saw it as inherently exploitative, with the owners of capital profiting off the labor of workers.
He believes in a more egalitarian society, where everyone contributes according to their ability and receives according to their need.
Exactly. His famous quote, "From each according to his ability to each according to his needs," captures his vision of a communist society, where class distinctions and private property are abolished.
It's a powerful idea, but it raises questions about how such a system would actually work in practice. Who decides what people need, and how to distribute those resources fairly?
Those are the big questions that have been debated for centuries, and there's no easy answer. But understanding those contrasting views of Smith and Marx helps us grasp those fundamental tensions that continue to shape economic and political debates today.
So it's like a spectrum of ideas, with Smith on one end, Marx on the other, and most societies falling somewhere in between, trying to find that balance between individual freedom and collective well-being.
Exactly.
Now let's shift gears and talk about something we often take for granted: money. The book asks us to imagine a world without money, which seems almost impossible. What would that even look like?
I guess it would be a world of barter, where we have to trade goods and services directly for other goods and services.
Can you imagine trying to trade your carpentry skills for groceries? It would be incredibly inefficient.
It would be a logistical nightmare, trying to find someone who has what you need and also needs what you have would be a constant struggle.
Yeah.
That's why money emerged as a brilliant solution.
So money is like this universal language that simplifies exchange and makes trade so much easier.
Exactly. The book lists the three core functions of money: medium of exchange, store of value, and standard of value. As a medium of exchange, it allows us to trade goods and services without the complexities of barter. As a store of value, it allows us to save our purchasing power for later use. And as a standard of value, it gives us a common unit of measurement for comparing the worth of different things.
But here's where my mind gets blown. The book calls money everyone's imaginary friend. That sounds like something out of a children's book. What do they mean by that?
It's a provocative way of describing fiat money, the system we use today. Fiat money isn't backed by gold or any other physical commodity. It has value simply because we, as a society, agree that it does.
So it's like this: shared belief system that underpins our entire economy. Our dollars and euros are just pieces of paper or digital entries in a computer. But we trust that they have value, and that allows the system to work. It's almost like a magic trick.
It does feel like magic sometimes, but it's a powerful magic trick that facilitates trade, enables saving and investment, and allows for a complex and interconnected economy to function.
But it also highlights how fragile the system is. If we all suddenly lose faith in our currency, the whole thing collapses.
That's true. Trust is the foundation of the fiat money system, and that trust is constantly being tested by inflation, government policies, and global economic events.
Speaking of trust, let's talk about banks. I think of them as these big, imposing institutions, but they play this crucial role in our financial system. The book takes us back to the origins of banking. Can you paint a picture of what those early banks were like?
Early banks actually served a variety of functions. They financed trade, supported governments by lending them money, and even provided loans to the church. The book mentions those Italian banks during the Renaissance that were instrumental in developing innovative financial instruments. and finding creative ways to get around the church's prohibition on charging interest,
Oh, right.
also known as usury.
I remember reading about those clever currency exchange tactics they used to get around those restrictions.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how they found loopholes
Yeah.
in the system. But what about this concept of fractional reserve banking? The book highlights, it sounds a bit mysterious. Can you explain what it is?
Yeah.
And why it's so important for understanding modern banking?
Fractional reserve banking is a system where banks only need to hold a fraction of their deposits in reserve, allowing them to lend out the rest. This is what allows banks to create money.
Yep.
Imagine a goldsmith who holds deposits of gold for safekeeping. He issues receipts for those deposits, which people can use to make transactions. But he realizes that not everyone comes to withdraw their gold at the same time. So he starts lending out a portion of that gold, keeping just enough in reserve to meet daily demands.
It's like they're playing with fire, isn't it? Lending out money they don't actually have on hand.
It is risky, but it's also the engine that drives economic growth. By lending out those excess reserves, banks create new money, which fuels investment, business expansion, and job creation. The book uses the example of a $100 deposit to illustrate how this process works. Let's say the bank has a reserve requirement of 10%.
Okay.
They hold $10 in reserve and lend out $90. That $90 ends up in someone else's account, and that bank can then lend out a portion of that, and so on.
The money supply expands with each round of lending.
So it's like this chain reaction, with that initial deposit rippling through the economy,
Right.
creating more money along the way.
Right.
Sounds pretty amazing, but also a bit scary, right?
Yeah.
What happens if everyone suddenly wants their money back? That's the inherent risk of fractional reserve banking. If people lose confidence in the system and start demanding their deposits, it can trigger a bank run and potentially a financial crisis.
Oh, right.
That's why we have bank regulations. Governments trying to strike a balance between allowing banks to lend and create money while also ensuring that the system is stable and protected from those kinds of panics.
It seems like finding that balance is a constant challenge, especially as the financial system gets more complex and interconnected.
It is.
The book mentions a whole series of banking crises
Hard.
throughout history,
Yeah.
from the National Bank Act of 1863 during the Civil War, to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 after a major panic, to the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, and of course the 2008 financial crisis. It seems like we're constantly learning from these crises and trying to adjust regulations to prevent the next one.
That's the nature of financial innovation. Always pushing the boundaries, finding new ways to create credit and leverage, which can lead to booms, but also make the system more vulnerable to collapses. It's like a constant game of cat and mouse between financial innovation and regulation.
Now, let's dive into one of those core concepts that underpins so much of economics, supply and demand. I've always thought of it as like the heartbeat of the market, where buyers and sellers come together to determine prices and quantities. The book gives a great overview of how it all works. But I'm curious, are markets always right? Do they always lead to the best outcomes?
It's a great question. Markets are powerful mechanisms for allocating resources, but they're not perfect. Economists talk about market failures, situations where markets don't achieve an efficient or socially desirable outcome.
So what are some examples of these market failures? What happens when that invisible hand kind of fumbles the ball?
Well, one classic example is public goods, like national defense or street lighting. These goods are non-rivalrous, meaning one person's use doesn't diminish another person's use, and non-excludable, meaning it's difficult to prevent people from benefiting from them, even if they don't pay.
So it's hard for private companies to make a profit from providing these goods because they can't charge everyone. Who benefits?
Exactly. It creates what economists call the free rider problem. People can enjoy the benefits of public goods without paying for them. That's why governments typically step in to provide these goods, funding them through taxes.
It makes sense. Like everyone chipping in to pay for those things we all benefit from, like clean air, safe roads, a strong national defense.
Right.
What are some other examples of market failures?
Another big one is externalities.
Okay.
These are costs or benefits that spill over to third parties who aren't directly involved in a transaction. The classic example is pollution.
Okay.
A factory might produce goods that people want, but it also pollutes the air and water, harming nearby residents who don't buy those goods.
So the market price of those goods doesn't reflect the full cost to society, including the cost of that pollution.
Exactly. And that's where governments often step in with regulations, taxes, or other policies to try to internalize those costs.
So it's about finding ways to make those polluters pay for the damage they cause so that the true cost is reflected. in the price of those goods.
Right.
So.
And there are also positive externalities.
Mm-hmm.
Think about education. When someone gets an education, it not only benefits them personally, but it also benefits society as a whole. A more educated workforce leads to greater innovation, productivity, and economic growth.
So there's a social benefit to education that goes beyond the individual's private gain.
Exactly. And that's why governments often subsidize education, recognizing those positive externalities.
So it's like an investment in the future of society.
Right. And then there's the tragedy of the commons,
Okay.
which happens when shared resources,
Right.
like fisheries or forests, get overused and depleted. Because individuals, acting in their own self-interest, don't take into account the long-term consequences.
So if everyone's just trying to catch as many fish as they can, they might end up depleting the fish stock and arming everyone in the long run.
Exactly. It highlights the need for collective action, rules, and regulations to manage those shared resources sustainably.
It's a reminder that sometimes we need to cooperate and think about those long-term consequences of our actions rather than just focusing on our immediate individual gain.
Absolutely.
Now, before we get too lost, in the world of market failures, let's circle back to those core concepts of supply and demand and explore how they work in this kind of idealized market, perfect competition.
Perfect competition.
It sounds like a unicorn, something beautiful and rare. Does it actually exist in the real world?
Probably not in its pure form, but it's a useful benchmark. For understanding how markets work, perfect competition assumes a large number of buyers and sellers, identical products, easy entry and exit for firms, and perfect information, meaning everyone knows the price and quality of the goods being offered.
It sounds a bit like a utopian market, where everyone has equal power and access to information.
In a way it is. The book uses the example of wheat farmers.
Right.
They're all selling essentially the same product. So no single farmer can dictate the price. They're all price takers, meaning they have to accept the market price, determined by the forces of supply and demand.
It's like a giant auction where the price keeps adjusting until it finds that equilibrium point where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded.
Exactly. And in perfect competition, firms are motivated to produce as efficiently as possible to keep their costs down and maximize their profits.
But what about those profits? Do they last forever in a perfectly competitive market?
That's where the concept of long-run equilibrium comes in.
Okay.
The book explains how, in the long run, profits in a perfectly competitive market are driven towards zero.
Zero profits. Why would anyone bother staying in business if they're not making any money?
That's where the distinction between accounting profit and economic profit is important. Accounting profit is just revenue minus explicit costs, like wages and materials. Economic profit takes into account opportunity costs, which includes the return you could be getting from investing your time and resources elsewhere.
So even if a firm is earning zero economic profit, it's still covering its opportunity cost. It's earning enough to stay in business, but it's not making any extra profits above and beyond what it could be earning doing something else.
Exactly. The book uses the example of a teacher who quits their job to open a bakery.
Okay.
Let's say the bakery earns an accounting profit of $50,000 a year. But if the teacher could be earning $60,000 a year teaching, then their economic profit is actually negative $10,000.
So they're making money, but they're actually losing out compared to what they could be earning in their next best alternative.
Right. And that's why in a perfectly competitive market, those extra profits tend to disappear in the long run. If firms are making above average profits, new firms enter the market.
Speaker. New firms enter the market, attracted by those profits, and they introduce new products and variations, further increasing competition and driving down prices.
Right.
So it's this constant push and pull with the market always seeking that equilibrium point where everyone is earning just enough to stay in the game, but no one is making those like juicy, outsized profits.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process that helps ensure efficiency and responsiveness to changes in consumer demand.
Perfect competition might be a theoretical ideal, but it helps us understand those underlying forces that shape market behavior.
Absolutely.
Now let's move along that spectrum of market structures, from perfect competition to those situations where firms have more power to influence prices. The book talks about monopolistic competition, which seems like a bit of a contradiction. How can you have competition and monopoly at the same time?
Monopolistic competition is actually quite common in the real world. It's a market structure with many firms, like perfect competition. But the key difference is that each firm sells a slightly differentiated product.
So instead of selling identical wheat, like those farmers in perfect competition, firms in monopolistic competition try to make their products stand out.
Yeah, think about restaurants, clothing stores, or even different brands of toothpaste. They're all competing for customers, but they're trying to differentiate themselves through branding, advertising, style, location, or other factors.
So consumers have a lot of choices, but those choices aren't perfectly interchangeable.
Exactly. This differentiation gives firms in monopolistic competition some degree of pricing power. They're not just price takers like in perfect competition, but they also face competition from other firms offering similar products, so they can't just charge whatever they want.
So it's like this balancing act
Yeah.
between differentiation and competition.
Right. And in the long run, just like in perfect competition, those above-average profits in monopolistic competition tend to get competed away. New firms enter the market attracted by those profits, and they introduce new products and variations, further increasing competition and driving down prices.
It's fascinating how this dynamic plays out in so many industries. But what about those situations where competition is really limited, where a few big players dominate the market? The book talks about oligopolies,
Okay.
and that sounds a bit more ominous.
Oligopolies are where things get interesting
Mm.
and potentially concerning. It's a market structure with a few dominant firms, high barriers to entry, and less overall competition.
So it's like a game with fewer players, and those players have more power to influence the rules.
Think about airlines, cell phone providers, or certain industries. Where there are just a handful of big names, the book explores why this concentration of power matters.
Okay.
Less competition generally means higher prices, less innovation, and potentially less choice for consumers.
So it's not just about the number of choices we have, but about the overall level of competition driving innovation and keeping prices in check.
Right. And oligopolies can be tricky to regulate because those big players have a lot of influence and resources to lobby governments and shape policies to their advantage.
It seems like a constant struggle to prevent those big players from colluding and acting like a monopoly, even if they technically operate as separate companies.
That brings us to the intriguing world of collusion and cartels, where firms try to cooperate instead of competing, often to the detriment of consumers.
The book uses OPEC, the oil cartel, as an example, like a club of oil-producing countries that get together and decide how much oil to produce to keep prices high.
OPEC is a fascinating case study in how cartels operate. They set production quotas for each member country, and they have mechanisms to try to enforce those quotas and punish cheaters who overproduce. Saudi Arabia, as the largest producer, often plays the role of the enforcer, wielding its influence to maintain discipline within the cartel.
But cartels are inherently unstable, aren't they? There's always an incentive for individual members to cheat and try to produce more than their quota to kind of grab a larger share of the profits.
That's where game theory comes in. It's a branch of economics that analyzes strategic decision-making in situations where the outcome depends on the actions of others.
The classic example is the prisoner's dilemma.
Right, where two suspects are interrogated separately, and they each have an incentive to betray the other, even though they'd both be better off.
If they cooperated and stayed silent.
Exactly. It highlights how individual rationality can sometimes lead to collective irrationality.
Right.
So even if those OPEC countries agree to limit production, there's always that temptation to cheat, especially if they think they can get away with it.
Right. And that's why cartels often struggle to maintain those agreements over the long term. They're constantly battling those internal pressures and the temptation to cheat.
It's like a high-stakes game of economic poker, where everyone's trying to read the other players and figure out their next move.
Now let's move to the end of that spectrum, where a single firm dominates the market. Monopoly.
Monopoly, the ultimate concentration of power. Makes me think of those board games, where one player ends up owning everything and everyone else is bankrupt. In economics, a monopoly is defined as a single seller dominating the market. With no close substitutes for its product, they have significant pricing power, and they can often earn those outsized profits. They get competed away in more competitive markets.
So are monopolies always bad for consumers?
Not necessarily. The book acknowledges that there are certain types of monopolies that can be justified or even beneficial.
What are some examples? When is a monopoly not such a bad thing?
Natural monopolies, like utilities, often make sense because it's more efficient. To have a single provider, think about electricity generation or water distribution. It would be incredibly costly and disruptive to have multiple companies running power lines or water pipes throughout a city.
So it's cheaper and more practical to have one company handling those essential services, but they need to be regulated to prevent them from abusing their power.
Exactly.
Then there are technological monopolies, which often arise from patents. Governments grant patents
To incentivize innovation, giving inventors exclusive rights to their inventions. For a limited period, it allows them to recoup their research and development costs.
Yeah.
And potentially earn profits from their innovations.
But those patents can also create temporary monopolies,
Yeah.
which can lead to higher prices for consumers. It's a trade-off between incentivizing innovation and ensuring affordability.
Right.
And then there are geographic monopolies, which might exist simply because of location. Think of that lone gas station in the middle of nowhere. They can charge a premium because there's no other option for miles.
Exactly.
So monopolies aren't always inherently evil, but it's important to distinguish between those situations where a monopoly might be justified or even beneficial, and those situations where monopoly arises from anti-competitive behavior or abuse of market power. So it's about understanding the context and the potential impact on consumers.
Right. And it often comes down to the role of government and regulation. How do we prevent those monopolies from exploiting their power and harming consumers? Do we break them up? Do we regulate their prices? Or do we find other ways to promote competition?
Those are tough questions, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
It's a constant challenge for policymakers to find that balance between promoting innovation, protecting consumers, and ensuring a fair and competitive marketplace.
Now, the book delves into the role of government in the marketplace, going beyond just regulating monopolies. It talks about price ceilings, price floors, and subsidies. It seems like governments are always tinkering with the market, trying to fix things or help certain groups.
Well, governments have a variety of tools at their disposal to try to influence market outcomes. Price ceilings are maximum prices set by the government, usually for essential goods like rent or food.
The goal is to make those goods more affordable, right?
Exactly. But as the book points out, those price ceilings can also lead to unintended consequences if the price ceiling is set below the market equilibrium price. It can create shortages.
Yeah, because suppliers aren't willing to produce as much at that lower price, and consumers demand more at that lower price, leading to that gap between supply and demand.
Right. And those shortages can lead to black markets, rationing, or other distortions.
In the market, the book uses the example of New York City's rent control policies, which have been in place for decades. They've certainly made housing more affordable for some tenants, but they've also created this complex and often dysfunctional housing market with long waiting lists, limited availability, and incentives for landlords to cut corners on maintenance.
Dig a classic case study in how price controls, while well-intentioned, can sometimes create more problems than they solve.
So it's about understanding those unintended consequences and weighing the costs and benefits. And then there are price floors, which are minimum prices set by the government, often for agricultural products or labor. Most common example is the minimum wage.
Right. The goal is to ensure that workers earn a living wage.
But again, those price floors can have unintended consequences if the minimum wage is set above that market equilibrium wage. It can lead to job losses, as employers might not be willing to hire as many workers at that higher wage.
It's a classic debate in economics, with strong arguments on both sides. Some argue that the minimum wage helps lift people out of poverty and boost the economy, while others argue that it harms low-skilled workers by reducing job opportunities. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
And then there are subsidies, which are government payments to producers to encourage the production of certain goods or services. The book uses the example of farm subsidies, which have been a contentious issue for decades.
Farm subsidies are intended to stabilize food prices, support farmers, and ensure a secure food supply. But they can also distort markets, lead to overproduction,
and harm the environment. It's another example of how those government interventions, even with the best intentions, can sometimes create those unintended consequences.
Exactly.
Now let's shift gears and explore how we measure the overall performance of an economy. The book introduces that all-important concept of gross domestic product, or GDP. Seems like it's a bit of an obsession in the news and among policymakers.
It is. Why is GDP so important?
I think of GDP as like a scorecard for the economy, a way to measure how much a country is producing. But the book does a good job of explaining what it is and what it's not.
GDP is the total value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given year. It's a measure of the overall economic activity, the size of the pie, so to speak.
But it's important to remember that GDP doesn't capture everything that's valuable in a society, right? It doesn't measure things like happiness, environmental quality, or social well-being.
Exactly. GDP is a useful metric. But it's not the be-all and end-all of economic progress. And the book also points out that there are different ways to calculate GDP. And those different methods can sometimes lead to different results.
So it's not always a perfect or objective measure, but it's still a useful tool for understanding those broad trends in an economy, right?
Absolutely. And it's important to distinguish between nominal GDP and real GDP.
Nominal GDP is measured at current prices, so it can be inflated by rising prices, even if actual output hasn't increased.
Right. Real GDP adjusts for inflation, giving us a more accurate picture of changes in actual production.
So it's about separating those price increases from actual growth in the quantity of goods and services being produced.
Exactly. And GDP is a key component of how we track the business cycle, those fluctuations in economic activity that economies experience.
The book uses that analogy of a road trip, with passing cars representing booms and near collisions representing recessions.
It's a vivid way to visualize those economic ups and downs. And those fluctuations are often reflected in changes in GDP, unemployment, and inflation.
Speaking of unemployment, the book highlights how it's more than just a number. It has real-world consequences for individuals, families, and communities.
Unemployment is defined as actively seeking work, but being unable to find it. But as the book points out, not everyone who's not working is unemployed. Toddlers, retirees, and stay-at-home parents are not part of the labor force.
And there are different types of unemployment, right? Not all joblessness is created equal.
There's frictional unemployment, which is that short-term natural churn as people move between jobs or enter the workforce for the first time. Then there's structural unemployment, which arises from mismatches between the skills workers have and the jobs that are available. And finally, there's cyclical unemployment, the bad one that's caused by recessions, when overall demand in the economy falls and businesses lay off workers.
So even when the economy is doing well, there will always be some level of unemployment. Economists call this the natural rate of unemployment.
It's the rate that exists when the economy is at full employment, with no cyclical unemployment. But this rate can change over time due to factors like technological advancements, changes in demographics, or government policies.
The book also doesn't shy away from the social and psychological costs of unemployment.
Right. It's not just about lost income, but also the impact on self-esteem, family relationships, mental health, and even crime rates.
Those broader costs are often overlooked, but they're crucial for understanding the full impact of unemployment on individuals and communities.
Now let's talk about another economic bogeyman, inflation. It's like that silent thief that erodes the value of our hard-earned money.
Inflation is a general rise in prices, and it can be a real challenge for individuals, businesses, and policymakers. It makes it harder to plan for the future, and it can create uncertainty and instability in the economy.
The book distinguishes between demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Demand pull inflation happens when there's too much money chasing too few goods. It's like a bidding war. That drives up prices.
Okay.
Cost push inflation occurs when the cost of production, like wages or raw materials, increase. And those higher costs get passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices.
And then there's the extreme case of hyperinflation.
Right, which can wipe out savings and destroy an economy.
The book uses that example of Zimbabwe, where inflation spiraled out of control, and people were literally using wheelbarrows of cash to buy basic necessities.
It's a stark reminder of how quickly things can unravel when inflation gets out of control.
But the book also acknowledges that inflation isn't always a bad thing for everyone. Borrowers can benefit from inflation because their debts become easier to repay in inflated dollars. But those gains are often outweighed by the broader negative consequences.
Right. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of savings, sorts investment decisions, and can create this climate of uncertainty and instability.
So it's no wonder that central banks, like the Federal Reserve, make it their mission to keep inflation in check. The book explains how disinflation, a slowing down of the inflation rate, can be a good thing, but it can also be painful. In the short run, it uses the example of Paul Volcker, the former Fed chairman, who took these drastic measures to tame inflation in the early 1980s, triggering a recession in the process.
It highlights those tough choices policymakers sometimes have to make, balancing short-term pain for potential long-term gain. And the book also emphasizes how expectations play a crucial role in inflation. If people expect prices to rise, they might start spending more now, which can actually drive up prices, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's like that fear of missing out, except it's about buying things before they get even more expensive.
Exactly. And that's why central bankers are so careful with their words. They try to manage expectations as much as they manage actual economic conditions.
Makes you realize how much psychology plays into economics. It's not just about those rational models, but also about those irrational fears and expectations that can shape behavior.
Right. Economics is ultimately about human behavior.
Yeah.
And we're not always perfectly rational creatures.
Now, the book introduces these concepts of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which seem like they're taking supply and demand to a whole new level.
It's basically supply and demand, but on a macro scale. You get the entire economy. Aggregate demand represents the total spending in the economy at various price levels, while aggregate supply represents the total output that firms are willing to produce at those price levels.
So it's about understanding those big picture forces that shape overall economic activity.
Right. And the book emphasizes this distinction between the short run and the long run in macroeconomics.
Why is that distinction important?
Because it affects how the economy responds to shocks, like policy changes or unexpected events. In the short run, some prices, like wages, are sticky. They don't adjust immediately. But in the long run, all prices eventually adjust to changes in supply and demand.
So a sudden increase in demand might lead to both higher prices and higher output in the short run.
But in the long run, those higher prices might lead to higher wages, which could eventually push output back down. That interplay between short run and long run adjustments is key to understanding how the economy behaves, and those aggregate demand and supply curves intersect to determine the overall price level and output of the economy, what economists call macroeconomic equilibrium.
Right.